The cowboy only wanted to save a stranger's life. But before the sun set, he would be forced to choose between surrendering her or starting a war that could cost them both everything. The first gunshot echoed through the Wyoming hills, like thunder rolling across frozen stone. Luke Carver stopped repairing his fence and listened. Years of surviving the frontier had taught him that bullets always carried a story. These were not warning shots. Someone was chasing someone. Without another thought, he grabbed his Winchester, mounted his horse, and rode toward the canyon where the sounds had come from. Dust swirled beneath the hooves as the wind howled across the empty plains. At the same moment, Clara Hale struggled to stay calm inside the stagecoach rumbling toward Bitter Creek. She had escaped a wealthy ranch owner named Preston Ward, a man who had kept her trapped behind expensive walls for 2 miserable years. The town believed she had been his willing companion, but no one knew the truth. She had been controlled, threatened, and isolated until she discovered that her father had died months earlier, while Ward deliberately hid the news. That discovery gave her the courage to flee before sunrise with nothing except a small trunk, a family locket, and $7. The passengers judged her with cold eyes, whispering cruel words they thought she could not hear. Clara ignored them, staring across the endless prairie and praying freedom truly existed somewhere beyond the horizon. Suddenly, rifle fire shattered the silence. The driver shouted as masked riders burst from the rocks above. Horses screamed while bullets tore through the coach. One guard fell instantly. Another returned fire before collapsing beside the wheel. The frightened horses bolted, dragging the stage wildly across the road until one wheel struck a boulder. The coach flipped violently, throwing passengers into splintered wood and shattered glass. Clara was hurled into the dirt, striking her shoulder against a stone before tumbling down a steep embankment. Pain exploded through her side, but fear pushed her forward. She crawled into thick brush while the outlaws searched the wreckage. Their leader cursed loudly. "Find the woman! Mr. Ward wants her alive!" Hearing those words, Clara knew the attack had never been about robbery. It had been arranged to capture her. Bleeding from a deep cut on her leg, she forced herself deeper into the canyon until exhaustion finally stole her strength. As darkness settled across the hills, Luke Carver followed fresh tracks into the narrow valley. There, lying unconscious beside a stream with blood staining her dress, he found the woman every armed rider seemed desperate to recover. Luke dismounted quietly, keeping one hand on his rifle while kneeling beside the unconscious woman. Blood soaked the lower part of Clara's dress where a jagged rock had torn through the fabric. Her breathing was weak but steady. He looked around, carefully, searching for movement among the trees before lifting her into his arms and placing her gently across his horse. The ride back to his cabin took nearly an hour through narrow trails few outsiders knew existed. Inside the small wooden cabin, Luke lit a lantern, boiled clean water, and gathered the simple medical supplies he kept for himself and his cattle. Clara slowly regained consciousness, panic flashing across her face as she tried to sit up. The sharp pain forced her back onto the bed. Luke stepped away with both hands visible. "Easy," he said calmly. "You're safe here. No one's touching you." She studied the scar across his face, the tired eyes, and the rifle leaning against the wall. He looked dangerous, yet strangely honest. When Luke carefully cleaned the blood from her injured leg, she winced but remained silent. As he wrapped the bandage, the wet cloth slipped unexpectedly from his fingers, brushing farther up her thigh than he intended while trying to stop the bleeding. He immediately pulled his hand back and looked away. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I was only trying to keep the wound from bleeding." Clara noticed the embarrassment in his voice. It was the first apology she had ever received from a man after being touched. Instead of fear, she felt something unfamiliar. Respect. "You don't have to apologize," she whispered. "You stopped when you realized." Their conversation ended as distant hoofbeats echoed outside. Luke blew out the lantern and looked through the window. 6 armed riders circled the cabin. Their leader called into the darkness. "That woman belongs to Preston Ward. Hand her over and we'll leave peacefully." Luke quietly loaded his rifle. "People don't belong to people," he answered. A bullet smashed through the cabin wall. Luke fired back instantly, forcing 2 riders behind their horses. Clara crawled toward the back window despite the pain. Luke opened a hidden trapdoor beneath a rug. "There's an old storage tunnel leading to the creek," he said. "If they get inside, you run. Don't wait for me." Clara looked at him with disbelief. "You don't even know me. Why risk your life?" Luke's eyes never left the window. "Because I know what happens when good people stay silent." Outside, the riders prepared to rush the cabin together. Inside, Luke tightened his grip on the rifle, knowing the next few minutes would decide whether they lived or died. The first outlaw charged through the front door just as Luke fired. The blast threw the man backward into the dust while the others scattered for cover. Bullets ripped through the cabin walls, filling the room with splintered wood and smoke. Luke moved from window to window, refusing to let the riders surround the house. Clara, though still weak from blood loss, remembered the revolver hidden inside the trunk she had carried from Cheyenne. She crawled across the floor, found the weapon, and loaded the few cartridges she had left. When one outlaw slipped around the back of the cabin and aimed at Luke through the broken window, Clara fired first. The shot struck the man's shoulder, forcing him to drop his rifle. Luke glanced at her in surprise, then gave a brief nod before returning to the fight. Realizing they were losing, the remaining riders pulled back toward the trees. Their leader shouted, "Ward himself is coming. You can't hide forever." Within minutes, the sound of dozens of horses rolled across the valley. Preston Ward arrived with armed ranch hands, his expensive black coat untouched by dust. He stepped forward confidently and smiled at Clara. "You've caused enough trouble," he said. "Come home and I'll forgive everything." Clara slowly stood beside Luke despite the pain in her leg. For the first time, she answered without fear. "I was never home. I was your prisoner." Ward laughed and reached inside his coat for a pistol, but before he could draw it, the sound of more horses echoed behind him. The town sheriff rode into the clearing with several deputies and 2 stagecoach survivors who had escaped the ambush. One wounded guard pointed directly at Ward. "He's the one who hired them," the man declared. Another rider produced letters recovered from one of the captured outlaws, proving Ward had ordered Clara's capture and the attack on the stagecoach. Seeing the evidence, the sheriff arrested Ward and his men without another shot. As they were led away in chains, Ward glared at Clara, but this time his power was gone. Days later, the valley became quiet again. Clara's wounds healed slowly, and she chose to remain at Luke's ranch until she was strong enough to decide her own future. She helped repair fences, planted a small garden, and filled the lonely cabin with laughter it had not heard in years. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Luke handed her the old family locket he had repaired himself. "No one owns your future," he said softly. Clara smiled, closed her fingers around the locket, and looked across the endless Wyoming plains. She had arrived with nothing except fear. Now she carried something far more valuable, her freedom, her dignity, and the hope of building a new life beside the man who had rescued her, not because she was helpless, but because every person deserved the chance to live free.